Chapter 2. Regulations. Regulations are a necessary part of life. The unregulated life does not exist. The only escape from regulations is in the grave. Regulations govern us from the day of our birth. We are governed by our physical being, by the laws of God and of man, by our parents, our church, our school, our society, our friends, our callings, and much, much more. It is necessary to stress this fact strongly and to keep it constantly in mind, because it is a myth propagated by all statists that apart from the state, man's life remains unregulated and hence lawless. Two important and equally dangerous myths are maintained by all statists as articles of faith. First, it is held that all life outside the state and its controlling government is unregulated life. In promoting this myth, the statists also promote a quote-unquote remedy implicit in that assertion. If all life outside the state is unregulated life, then the quote-unquote answer to that unregulated life is state regulation. To be outside the state is presupposed to be in anarchy and chaos, and to be within the state is assumed to be orderly and just. This was an article of faith in ancient paganism, so that a stateless man was seen as virtually a dead man, a man without being. Jacobson cites an ancient Mesopotamian principle basic to the culture of the time. Quote, "The command of the palace, like the command of Anu, cannot be altered. The king's word is right. His utterance, like that of a god, cannot be changed." End quote. Given such a premise, man outside the state is in an evil condition. This, of course, leads to the second myth, that the non-state regulated life is a lawless life. Law is thus assumed to be exclusively an act of state. In terms of biblical faith, law is the prerogative of God, not of man, because lawmaking is an attribute of sovereignty, and God alone is sovereign. However, not all regulations are laws. A law expresses, in the biblical sense, God's justice, his demand of righteousness or justice for all men. A treaty and a contract bind only a few parties, sometimes only two. A contract between Jones and Smith has a binding force for Jones and Smith, but none for me. A contract is under law, but distinct from it. The marriage contract between my wife and myself is under law, and at points potentially subject to the jurisdiction of God and the state, but my wife and I have kept that contract in faithfulness to God and without any need whatsoever for recourse to state law. My relationship to my surviving parent, my mother, is outside the state's law, but not outside God's law, but it is as regulated and lawful as possible. The non-state regulated life is by no means a lawless life. These two myths rest on still another myth. According to this third myth, the state is the agency and source of both law and morality. All law is simply enacted morality, and the state, by claiming to be the source of law and by seeking a monopoly of lawmaking, declares itself to be the ground of morality and hence of law. This is, of course, a particularly dangerous assertion in the myth and is basic to the state's tacit claim to be God walking on earth. The man or institution which is then unregulated by the state is by definition immoral. Moral status then becomes life under statist regulations. The result is a radical restructuring of society in terms of the moral and religious ultimacy of the state. The state, to fulfill its mission, embarks on an imperialistic crusade against men and institutions, corporations, schools, properties, and all things else determined to save the world by statist regulation. Those who resist statist controls are seen then as somehow immoral and devious, as enemies and exploiters of mankind, or at the very least as unrealistic fools who fail to understand that morality requires state controls. These three myths lead forth to a significant fact. Statist legislation and controls lessen the regulation of a society instead of enhancing it. Contracts, once basic to society and to commerce, were once regarded as one of the central forms of social regulation, and they were all a part of what is curiously called the private sector, that is, of non-statist society, of the public world. Statist controls have steadily diminished the role of contracts in every area of life. At this point, it is necessary to introduce a very real distinction which we have previously disregarded in order to lay a broader foundation in terms of common usage. There is a very real difference between regulations and controls. Regulation comes from a Latin word meaning rule, that is, a standard, norm, or law. Regula, ruler or rule, carries into the word regulation the concept of a norm, yardstick, or law apart from man and the state. Control, on the other hand, comes from a French word meaning a register, roll, or catalogue. An agency imposes controls. By its origin, regulation implies a rule of principle which governs men because they, at the very least, believe in it. Thus, as we examine the current scene, we must say that the modern state is unregulated by principles of supra-state validity and is hostile to regulations and favours rather controls, more specifically, its controls. Parenthetically, we can note that the Church has also too often favoured controls, church-imposed controls, instead of seeking to bring men under the regulation of God and His law by His Holy Spirit. Thus, we must say emphatically that statist controls not only lessen the regulation of society, but work towards the destruction of regulation. Again and again in history, statist controls have gone hand in hand with the demoralization of society and the erosion of religion. Fifth, another significant fact is that statist controls not only lessen the regulation of a society, but they also lessen its freedom. The greater the element of regulation in a society, that is, dependence on the rule of faith and principles, the greater the freedom of that society. Quote, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty." 2 Corinthians 3:17. The more we are truly governed by God's law and the Spirit of God, the less we are then governed by the state, and the greater our freedom. For the state, freedom is immoral. It means an uncontrolled life, a life outside the state and its laws. The free man becomes the immoral man, the enemy to the statist. The statist panacea is, of course, controls by the state. In 1978, apart from all municipal, county, state, and federal laws, the federal bureaucracy added 15,452 pages to the Federal Register. These are all new rules designed to control every conceivable area of life. In the 1980s, the rules will increase even more. Weidenbaum notes these controls lead to an amazing requirements on companies and institutions for compliance. Thus, quote, one drug company's application to the FDA for approval of a skeletal muscle relaxant consisted of 456 volumes. They weighed more than a ton and stood taller than an 8-story building. End quote. Such incidents are routine. It should be apparent by now that we are strongly opposed to the vast edifice of statist controls, but believe rather in regulation by the law of God. Most people, of course, including most churchmen today, are hostile to biblical law. Many feel apoplectic on reading of God's condemnation of their own pet sins. The Bible does have some death penalties which are very upsetting to modern man, and it leaves some men in a state of shock to learn that anyone believes in them. The fact is, however, that a careful cataloguing of biblical law makes clear that, first, God claims total jurisdiction over every area of life and thought. Because he is totally God, absolutely sovereign, his law is a total law. His right to declare law is grounded in the fact that he is the creator and the absolute lord or property owner of all creation. We are repeatedly told that, quote, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein," end quote, Psalm 24:1, Exodus 9:29, Deuteronomy 10:14, 1 Corinthians 10:26. Second, if we read God's law and catalogue the total number of offences and penalties, we find that the law is readily learned because it is a limited number of statutes, and that, in many cases, no man or state-imposed penalties follow upon violation of God's law. God himself imposes the penalty in many cases, in time or in eternity, so that he limits the power of man dramatically. The powers of man and of the states can never thus be legitimately confused with the powers of God. Some very important laws thus have no prescription for any enforcement by man. Third, this means plainly that the biblical emphasis is very strongly on regulation, not on status control. Albert J. Nock, in Our Enemy, the State, spoke of ancient Israel as a government rather than a state. To a great measure, this was true. Civil government was by means of elders, heads of households, with one elder over every 10 families, then elders over 50s, hundreds, thousands, etc., up to the Council of 70 Elders, later known as the Sanhedrin. In early Christian Europe, the College of Cardinals was, after the same pattern, made up of 70 laymen. Because the foundation of elder government was the family unit, which was also the basic regulating unit in society, the state was at most minimal. A faith in controls is faith indeed, but it is not biblical.